Well, thank you very much for the program overview and kicking off today's session, Dr. Day. And I'm privileged and honored to have the opportunity to kick off the technical aspect or the informational session that summarizes the research that the program has going on here at K-State. And we do, before we get too far, we do have some seats available up towards the front. For any of those that are in the back and would like to move up towards the front, there are some available seats. So please feel free to do that. I'm honored to have the chance to visit with everybody and represent the College of Veterinary Medicine on today's program, and as mentioned, appreciate Dean Rush for joining us. Another key person in the College of Veterinary Medicine that has joined us this morning is Dr. Frank Blecka, who's served a very important role leading the research efforts of the College of Veterinary Medicine for a number of years. So thank you both for joining us today and sharing some information with the attendees and audience. A lot of folks may remember Bo's information that he shared here last year at Swine Day, where he summarized a lot of the work that he did in his PhD program focused on bone mineralization. I want to revisit that topic, and I was visiting with Bo last night, and I've got quite a few slides summarizing some of his work, and asked if he wanted to come up and give it, and he said no, now that he's retired from graduate school, and he said he thinks I probably could do a decent job, so hopefully live up to that. So I want to briefly highlight what Bo covered last year. He did a nursery study and a finishing study, fed different levels of phosphorus, some different phytase, and what we wanted to do through those studies, but also extending into a diagnostic survey we'll talk about, focused on how do we measure bone mineralization? What do we measure? And then, importantly, what do we compare it to? Once we get a result and a number back from the diagnostic lab, what does it mean? So the overall objective of that project was to establish some baseline estimates for several biological indicators of bone mineralization. Understand how those measures would change when we vary different aspects of the diet, and ultimately help provide some guidance on what those values should be. So we did a late nursery study as well as a growing and finishing pig study, and then we'll have the diagnostic survey data that we'll talk about as well. So high-level overview of the two studies that Bo shared last year was when we measure bone ash, we take a bone, whether it be a metacarpal, a rib, any bone, and we determine bone ash, it's really important to know what technique is used. Was a defatted bone mineralization analysis technique used, or was a non-defatted technique used? Simply using based on what technique is used, that can change the bone ash measurement by 8 to maybe even 15%. So knowing what technique is used is really, really important. An interesting finding of the work was focused on bone density. If we take a bone, put it in a vacuum flask with ultra-pure water, and then we measure the weight of that bone suspended in water, it's a lot quicker than our current bone mineralization techniques, and it's actually pretty accurate. So that was one of the key findings of the research, is bone density may be a pretty quick and pretty easy measure that allows us to get some good information in a much more rapid time frame relative to the current techniques that we would have available. And then finally, through this work, we learned and further evaluated and quantified that health status has a huge impact on these measurements. If we take a healthy pig and a sick pig, we can see some pretty significant changes depending on what those specific parameters we are looking at. Also importantly, when we take a bone sample and we take that growth plate and look at it histologically, what we found is that the 10th rib actually is a little bit more sensitive to abnormalities of that growth plate development compared to the second rib, which is very common from a diagnostic perspective. So we helped the diagnosticians further understand what bones could we be looking at and what bones would help us understand differences in bone mineralization. Then that brings us to the new information this year, which is a diagnostic survey that Bo conducted. And this worked with a number of different companies shown on the screen. We collected 194 different pigs, 60 different sites, working with 14 production systems. From each of those sites, we took 3 pigs, a healthy pig, a sick pig, and a lame pig. We euthanized those animals, collected a bunch of samples, and we wanted to understand variation across system, variation within a system between those 3 different pig types, using a bunch of these different measurements. A quick refresher and review of how we'll be presenting some of this data is using box plots. So a box plot, the lower bound is the 25th percentile, the median, and then the 75th percentile. And then the whiskers extend up until a data point that does not exceed 1.5 times that range, with those dots out to the extreme being considered outliers. So now let's look at the 14 different production systems along the horizontal axis, labeled 1 through 14, and this is serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D. A couple of key points on this slide is that we see a lot of variation across systems. We know there are differences in diet formulation strategies, the amount of vitamin D in the diet, other sources of vitamin D, oral or in drinking water, but between systems we see a tremendous variation in the amount of vitamin D. Also important on this slide is that if we look within a system, we also see a lot of variation, ranging from in the high single digits, around 10 nanograms per milliliter of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, all the way up to about 50. So this is the sick, lame, and healthy pigs all together, but we see a lot of variation in vitamin D status within system and between system. So I said in one of the early slides, when we get a result, we have to know what to compare to. So this is some of the information, the best data we have available today, coming from some publications in the mid-2010s that would indicate that serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D should be somewhere in the range of 18 to 30. So if we take that 18 to 30 and go back to our graph that shows our 14 production systems, we see that that red bar covers a lot of those values that we measured within the survey. Again, this is sick, lame, and healthy pigs together. A lot of those are in that range. Some certainly are below. Some would be well above that. I mentioned health status is important. So this is that same data broken down by healthy pigs, lame pigs, and sick pigs. And what we see is that if we use that 18 to 30 range, that captures the majority of those healthy pigs. We have some that are above that 30 threshold. We certainly have some that are a little bit below as well. We see a little bit lower serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D in lame pigs, but what was really interesting in this slide is that we've documented and have a magnitude of effect now and a greater understanding of how much lower serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D can be for sick pigs. So one of the important takeaways from this slide is that when we take samples in a field setting, send it to the diagnostic lab, understanding what we're comparing that to. Do we want that, are we comparing that to a healthy pig? Or because a pig was off feed for a period of time, has a lower vitamin D status, we know those parameters and health status alone can affect what we would expect to see. Not only did we look at vitamin D, we also looked at a number of other blood measurements. This is just looking at serum phosphorus as an example. We see a little less variation between systems when we look at serum phosphorus, but what we do see is a pretty significant degree of variation within a system. If we look at those 16 pigs within this particular site, we see a lot of variation in serum phosphorus. Now this alone isn't all that indicative of a lot that's going on. There's a lot of differences, and again, this is sick, lame, and healthy, all combined into one. But then when we look at those pig types, we do see that the phosphorus that's circulating in the serum of these pigs is different depending on health status. With those sick pigs having a history of lower feed intake, lower phosphorus consumption, having lower serum phosphorus relative to similar to a lame pig, but both of which would be lower than the serum phosphorus of a healthy pig on full feed. So now let's focus a little bit on bone mineralization. What have we learned there? As mentioned, there's two primary techniques in which we can measure bone mineralization. One of those is a defatted technique, where we take that bone, put that bone in petroleum ether for roughly a week, and that takes all that fat material that's in that intramedullary cavity, and it removes that fat from that bone. So when we use a defatted technique, the resulting bone ash percentage is higher than we would see if we use the non-defatted technique, which is shown in this data here. What's interesting, though, is if we use the defatted technique, and if we look at the healthy, lame, or sick pigs, we don't see any difference in bone mineralization between those three health statuses if we use the defatted technique. However, if we use the non-defatted technique, we can see that sick pigs have a greater bone mineralization relative to the healthy pigs. So why may this be? Part of that is those sick pigs have a lower feed intake. They're in a negative energy balance state, so they're taking some of that intramedullary fat that's present within that bone and mobilizing it, thus leaving a lower percentage of fat remaining, giving us a higher bone ash percentage when using the non-defat technique. So again, key takeaway on this slide, understanding what technique we're using and how that technique may affect our interpretation of results. So in Bo's survey, we also had a chance to collect those 194 pigs, but also get some dietary information. How does phosphorus in the diet, how does calcium in the diet affect those measurements that we saw? This slide summarizes what we saw from a dietary perspective. If we break that data down by nursery pigs, finishing pigs, and then take a weighted average overall, what we see is that for phosphorus, we're feeding about 30% above the NRC requirement. Whereas for calcium, we're a little bit lower in the nursery, which goes into some of the information shared later this morning on acid binding capacity, buffering, limestone. It's pretty common for some folks to reduce the level of calcium, certainly early in the nursery, but then later on in the finisher and then the weighted average overall, very close to what the NRC would deem the requirement for calcium. And then we're feeding a lot more vitamin D relative to the requirement that would be established by NRC. So we took all those data, the information on the diet, and we wanted to say, what's the relationship between the diet and our measures of bone mineralization? So this is correlation coefficients, so R values, and if you take this value and square it, that'll give you the R squared, or the percentage of variation that can be explained by that relationship. Those values that are highlighted in red are statistically significant relationships. So if we look at the available phosphorus column, we see that as we increase the available phosphorus in the diet, we see an increase in bone mineralization of the non-defatted technique for the metacarpal as well as the fibula. Whereas if we look at calcium, total calcium in this case, if we increase the total calcium of the diet, we see an increase in bone density and breaking strength for the metacarpal, as well as defatted ash density and breaking strength down there as well. Now, if we advance a slide and look at the ribs, second rib and 10th rib, we see the same relationship for available phosphorus. More phosphorus gives us more mineralization, which makes a lot of sense. But calcium is a little bit more complicated, and we see an increase in defatted bone ash, density, and strength, but not an increase when feeding more calcium for non-defatted bone ash. Again, with this information being survey information, the results are highly dependent upon the diets and ranges that we're being fed. And as a reminder, we're feeding plenty of phosphorus in these diets, roughly 30% above NRC, whereas calcium is somewhere in that ballpark of NRC. So we don't have a huge range of calcium in this survey information, which could partially explain some of those responses that we're seeing. So together, if we increase phosphorus, we see more bone ash. It makes a lot of sense. And that response is more consistent in the ribs relative to looking at the metacarpal or fibula. Total calcium increases density and breaking strength, but the impact on bone ash is a little bit more variable. So together, what does all this survey information mean? What did we learn? We learned that there are differences between methods, and those differences are quite substantial. When we take a sample, when we submit it to the diagnostic lab, it's important to know what sample we collected and what technique is being used. That allows us to have the information needed to appropriately interpret. There are some clear differences in a number of these different analyses depending on health status, sick, lame, and healthy. So knowing that background health status is important because there can be some significant changes in those results that we get. We didn't have a chance to talk about it on the slide, but one of the interesting findings was that based on health status, we could see some differences in how they're using phosphorus, whether they're using that phosphorus for lean tissue growth, or if they're mobilizing that body tissue when they're in a negative energy balance state, as in a sick pig, they're secreting more of that phosphorus as well as creatinine, which is a muscle breakdown product, into the urine. So we saw some pretty interesting information there relative to health status and those types of products that we can find in the urine of these pigs as well. So that leads us to the question. Lots of interesting graphs. We see some variation across production sites, but What does all of it mean? What do we compare to? So this was the next step that Bo took, was we took some data from a number of our different trials, some of our phytase trials, some of his trials as well. So any trial where pigs were fed a diet that was sufficient in phosphorus and sufficient in calcium. We had a total of 484 bones that we compiled in this analysis of nursery pigs and 661 finishing pigs. We see a lot of variation. Nursery pigs, finishing pigs, the mean of these values for the metacarpal density, DFAT ash and non-DFAT ash, and then some different bones as well. Nursery pigs and finishing pigs. One of the key takeaways here, it's important which bone is used and what technique is used to do that analysis. So what are the labs used today? What can you take home and apply to your decision-making processes? Many of the diagnostic labs use the second rib today. It's easy to get to. It's been a cornerstone and a baseline of understanding bone mineralization. And generally, those diagnostic labs use a non-defatted ash technique. It helps increase the turnaround. If we use that DFAT technique, it adds a lot of time to the analysis. So second rib, non-defatted ash is typically what the laboratory is going to use within their analysis. We can see there, on average, about a 53.7% ash and about a 53% on the finishing pig side with a range. So together, if we have bone ash somewhere between 47-48% and about 57-58%, that's a pretty good range. We still need to understand and continue to communicate these reference ranges, but this information that Bo compiled allows us to understand what would be an expected range for different analyses. So that summarizes a lot of the bone mineralization work, the studies, the survey. Now to transition and talk and spend a few minutes talking about what we've learned on the phytase side. Macy Reeb conducted this study in collaboration with DSM, where we used their Hyphorius product. We formulated 3 diets with a 0.09% available phosphorus, and then we formulated 2 diets with a 0.27% available phosphorus. And within those low phosphorus diets, we added graded levels of phytase, 0, 600, or 1,000 FTUs per kilogram. Similarly, on the 0.27% available phosphorus, either 0 phytase added or 1,000 phytase units added. And what we see here for average daily gain is that in the low phosphorus diets, when we increased phytase, we increased average daily gain. We saw a numerical response in those high phosphorus diets, but that magnitude was not nearly as large. Thus, we did not see any statistically significant differences. When we look at metacarpal bone ash with the same treatment layout, we see that in the low phosphorus diets, increasing phytase increased metacarpal bone ash. We also see the same response in the 0.27% available phosphorus, where 0 phytase represented 36% ash, whereas when we added 1,000 phytase units on top of that, we saw about a 4% increase in bone ash. This indicates a couple of things for us. One is that 0.27% available phosphorus was not above the requirement of that pig, because additional phytase on top of that resulted in more bone mineralization. And similarly, when we look at the response on the growth side, that also partly could be explained by extra phosphoric effects of phytase, breaking down those anti-nutritional factors, releasing other nutrients other than just phosphorus in the form of phytate-bound phosphorus. So some good work to help us understand the phytase release patterns and characteristics of this newer phytase source. So together, if we take and generate some release estimates for available phosphorus release, using growth performance, either average daily gain or feed efficiency, we can see those values generated. If we look at bone mineralization, measure several different bones, take the average of those bones, we can see an estimated release there. So this data helps give us confidence in what release values we could be using for this product, as well as is very consistent with many other data sets that we have a chance to see, in that if we use measures of bone mineralization as our response to quantify available phosphorus release, generally we see a little bit lower releases than if we look at release estimates generated based on growth performance data. But overall, some solid data and a nice resource for nutritionists. Ilario also conducted some research, and in this study looked at a couple of different phosphorus levels, either 80% of the NRC phosphorus requirement or 115%. A couple of different treatments, either looking at a 1.25 to 1 analyzed calcium to analyzed phosphorus ratio and no phytase added in these left two treatments, or reducing that analyzed to analyzed ratio down to a 1.1 to 1 with the addition of 600 phytase units. What we see here is that if we look at the high phosphorus and low phosphorus diets, we see that when we reduce the phosphorus down to 80% here in this finishing trial, we see a reduction in average daily gain. However, we didn't see any other differences between treatments. Now, when we look at bone ash weight, we see that same response. When we reduce the phosphorus level, we see a reduction in bone mineralization. However, when we use that 115% NRC value for digestible phosphorus and compare that to those two bars to the right, which come with a lower calcium to phosphorus ratio, as well as the addition of phosphorus, we see a reduction in the amount of bone ash weight relative to our high phytase or high phosphorus diet, with that phosphorus coming in the form of monocalcium. Bone breaking strength, we see a similar pattern as well. We see that phosphorus effect, that is, we increase phosphorus to 115% of the NRC requirement. We see an increase in bone breaking strength, whereas those two treatments on the right with a lower calcium to phosphorus ratios with the addition of phytase resulted in intermediate values. One of the important parts, though, within this study is this last treatment included high D, which is a form of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. At the beginning of the study, we didn't see any evidence of a difference between treatments as we would expect, but when we fed those diets for 50 days, we see that that last treatment had a significant increase in serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D3 concentrations. And let's go back to what we'd expect to be a normal range. 18 to 30 in that ballpark based on some of the earlier data shown. And what we see here in this particular study, all of those treatments were quite a bit above that upper bound of 30. So the vitamin D status of these pigs on this experiment was quite good, but we do see an increase in serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D when high D is fed in the diet. So vitamin D3 is metabolized and undergoes a bioconversion process in the liver to form 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. Then if we take that 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, and it can go through an additional hydroxylation step in the kidney using 1-alpha hydroxylase to then form 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D3. What this product, which Larissa looked at, is a form of 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D3. And when 120 milligrams per kilogram or 200 milligrams per kilogram were fed, we saw an increase in bone ash percentage relative to that control diet, which only contained 1,650 international units per kilogram of vitamin D3. So what we learned from this experiment is that when we provide this product, we can increase the bone mineralization of those pigs. However, we didn't see any differences in 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which isn't all that surprising. As mentioned, this product is a source of 1,25-hydroxy, which has undergone an additional step. So when we take a step back and look, we don't see any differences in serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D. But together, this information shows that when using these types of products, we can increase serum levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D if we feed that form, or we can increase bone mineralization when using the product here being a source of 1,25-hydroxy. And then to wrap up, focusing on minerals as well within the theme of the initial discussion here, with some work that Hilario Cordoba has performed, looking at some mineral sources, whether zinc, manganese, and copper are fed in the form of sulfates or hydroxychloride minerals. Just trimming down some of the information here, looking at average daily gain in the later grower stages, the finisher stage, from 170 to 300 pounds of body weight. When those minerals are fed in the hydroxychloride form, we saw an increase in average daily gain relative to those minerals being fed in the sulfate form. At first cut, first marketing, we didn't see any difference in hot carcass weight for those first pigs marketed out of the barn, each weighing around 205 pounds carcass weight. But what we did see was that those last pigs out of the barn, that dump of that barn, we saw about a 3.5 pound increase in hot carcass weight for those pigs fed the hydroxychloride form relative to those pigs fed the sulfate forms. So again, some nice work by Hilario helping us understand the expected response in a commercial environment with these forms of minerals. So it's an opportunity to come up and share the research generated by the program here with the audience today. Tremendous honor. I would like to thank and express a sincere amount of gratitude to all the graduate students that make all of this work possible. The graduate students are highly successful in generating terrific research that we are fortunate to be able to share with you all today. And they're also very successful with a number of college, department, university, as well as national awards. So a number of students listed here, both in the animal science program, the grain science program, that have done a terrific job representing the university, both here on campus as well as out in the field. Any of the current graduate students, could I have you all please stand up? Don't be shy. Thank you all for all the work you do throughout the year, and please join me in thanking them. None of the work and the results generated would be possible without all the hard work, effort, early mornings out weighing pigs that all of you do. So we're very appreciative for your contributions to the program and excited to see where you go in your future careers.